Is it a
Yeah,
combination department?
yeah.
Gotcha. How many paid guys do you actually have?
We have about 8 that will rotate through being paid.
Okay,
8 to 10.
I gotcha.
So, yeah, yeah,
And the rest just sign up for shifts.
yeah.
That's
And
it,
that's
man.
it. Well, that's it. I mean, those are the guys that sign up for shifts. That's our pool to sign up for shifts. We have a couple that will come and pull a shift, but it's
Yeah,
not, we don't have an A, B, C. So, you know,
that
rural
sucks.
department with a limited budget. Yeah. We're making the most of it
Yeah,
though.
nah, that's good, dude. Hopefully the weather you guys have will stay away, as will the sickness for you guys.
Yeah.
But we'll keep
But
we'll
the
keep
good
this one
news,
short,
like
man.
we said last week, cool. Let's do it. Let's do it.
No, no, go for it. Finish what you were saying.
I'll
Sorry.
fill in on the cruise. Oh,
You what?
we got our new truck. We're buying a
Oh, you
truck.
did.
It'll
You
be here
got
in
it.
July. We got it. It's crazy. So when I was figuring out plexus, like when it comes to division casting, it's something that I have not been good about, and I'm getting better at it. Alita shared a great conversation. If you guys get to go back, take a look at what she had to say. But when it comes to vision casting, one of the things I always wanted to do with plexus was buy a small town fire department, a fire truck. I thought I would do that out of my own money. The cost of fire trucks has gone up a lot,
Yes. Yes.
but I did it. I just didn't do it with my own money, which actually works out in my favor because it was 2.1 mil before financing
Jeez. Yeah.
fees.
They're not
So
freaking
here we
cheap,
are.
dude. Hey, man. Congratulations, though.
But we're
Mission
doing it.
accomplished. That's incredible.
Thank
Luther,
you.
what's up?
Thank you. Check that one off.
Yeah, for sure. But we'll keep this. He's here. He's like, I'm here. That's all right. The past 5 days, I've been home for, I think, less than 30 hours. So we're all feeling it, but we're all here. And that's what I love about it. So welcome. I actually looked ahead of time this time. So I know this is episode 7 of the Broco podcast. I got it right. Talking about vulnerability in men and manliness and masculinity. And seeing as we're all here should be an interesting conversation. So we could just kick it off with a very simple: are men allowed to be vulnerable? Yes or no?
Luther
Yes.
is laughing quietly to himself in the background.
Uh, I'm trying to figure out my camera situation. I'm sorry. So we've
You look
already
beautiful.
started.
Don't worry
We've
about it.
already.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Okay.
just randomly
Cool.
hit record and we just kind of roll right into it.
All right. Cool. Men allowed to be vulnerable. That's an interesting question. Considering I, it is my belief that men are. It's not that. It's not whether or not we are allowed. I think vulnerability is a requirement. And I further believe that this idea that men somehow have to be hard, they have to be rigid, they have to be brash. I think a lot of that ideology has led to the downfall of the home, the downfall of marriages, the downfall of society, really. Because at the center of that is ego. And where ego exists, humility cannot. And so where there lacks humility, there lacks an ability to love. Um, you know, going back to our faith and the example that we have set for us there, humility is required. Without vulnerability, you don't have a desire to sacrifice because that's vulnerable, isn't it? So
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, are men allowed to be vulnerable? Yes, one, but I think for a man to really live out his calling, vulnerability is a requirement.
Dude,
That's my view.
I agree. That's hitting hard right from the top. And I worded it like that because I was just what brings to mind when it's like men and vulnerability is I see it now, but especially in the generation that we all grew up when it was I don't know about y'all, but growing up, it was like, hey, don't cry, you're fine, get up, you're okay, which kind of leads to vulnerability with feelings, and then you try to talk about something. No, I'm sure we've all either run in circles or been a part of circles, Mike Firehouse circles, where they're just like, you you can't share anything too deep or too mushy or wishy-washy because they'll be like, dude, what the heck is wrong with you? Like, stop being like that. Like, man up, you're fine, get over it, or whatever the heck may be. So that was the thought process behind the way I worded that. And I like that you connected vulnerability to sacrifice. Anyone want to chime in on what Luther said real quick? Because it was, man, knocked it out of the park right off the bat. Didn't expect anything less.
Yeah, he did. He did. And what I loved about it was almost like a two-part question for me. It's like, are men allowed to be vulnerable? Yes. But the question I come back to is, do men allow themselves to be vulnerable? Because I think that's another question right there in itself is, do we actually give ourselves permission to be vulnerable? I think that a lot of times that's where that societal pressures are those things that we may have heard in our own past and that stuff that we carry with us that come back and tell us, maybe no, maybe we're not allowed to be vulnerable because of reasons X, Y, or Z. So I think a lot of times we can tell others like, oh yeah, sure, it's fine to be vulnerable, but do we really give ourselves the permission? Because do we see ourselves as being weak if we do? Do we see ourselves as being less than this definition of masculinity, like what Luther talked about, not being as rigid, not being as strong? When in reality, there's strength in being vulnerable. There is strength in that sacrificing that you were talking about. So that's what was really resonating with me when you asked that question.
Bro, it goes
Yeah,
it
there's a strength.
really goes back. Yeah, it goes back to like Ian, you said, when we were little boys, like get up, you a man, don't cry, this, that, and third. Like I have a son now. And like I find myself parenting him very different, right? It's like, okay, man, look, you're allowed to express yourself, right? Like you're allowed to express yourself, but we're gonna do this in a healthy way. Like I don't tell him don't cry. I put my hand on his chest and I say, hey, talk to me. Tell me what's going on. Tell me what you're feeling, right? And giving him the permission as a growing young man to express himself. Now he's 2, right? And so we're trying to figure out these communication pathways, but I never want to put him in a box and say, hey, you're a man, don't cry, right? I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen my father cry. I cannot count on one hand the number of times I've cried. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I'm just being real. But here's the deal, right? Like that vulnerability, and again, everything in moderation, but that vulnerability is what allows my wife and I to be able to have real conversations without worrying about whether or not she's stepping on my toes or I'm stepping on her toes, right? And so it allows us to be able to communicate in a way that is healthy in our marriage, right? When my kids see me being vulnerable, it lets them know that daddy does have feelings and that daddy does care. Right? My daughter, she was having one of her defiant nights, where she had done something, and what it boils down to is, y'all, she was embarrassed. She was embarrassed. She knew what she had done wasn't smart. She didn't want to tell anybody what she had done, and so she was going to stick to her gun. She is my child. Right? And so I find myself going to not vulnerable daddy, being rigid, right? She had eaten a crayon of all things, right? This is what comes out in the end. She had eaten a crayon, but she didn't want to tell anybody she had eaten a crayon, but her mouth was black, right? So I'm just trying to figure out, like, let me make sure,
Chocolate's the best flavor.
right,
Right.
right. I'm like, let me make sure that you didn't eat something that's going to make you sick.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, dude, I'm going hard. I've given her a spanking. I have done like all of the things. And I'll never forget, like I had taken all of her stuff because she was just being defiant. My wife was trying to talk to her and she was being defiant. She just wasn't gonna break. And I closed the door and I sat outside of the door. And she started screaming, everybody hates me. I don't understand. Blah, 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 blah. And I sat there and God hit me with, how about you discipline her the way you wish you were disciplined? How about you discipline her with my love? And it rocked me. Like it legit changed me. And so I went back in and I sat down, and instead of being mad and belligerent and trying to get her to bend her will to mine, we had a conversation. Said, baby, here's what you need to understand. Daddy needs to know what you ate because I need to know that it's not going to hurt you, right? and I need to know that it's not going to make you sick. And she looked back at me with tears in her eyes and she said, because then you would never see me again. And I said, exactly. And daddy never wants that.
Yeah.
And you know what she did after that? She told the truth. All it took was being a little bit vulnerable, letting my ego go, and disciplining with the love that I've been shown in my mistake. It's really not
Yeah.
that hard.
But
We just complicate
no,
it.
it sounds so simple. It sounds so simple, but I think you hit it from the start where you're like being vulnerable costs something. We have to give up something to be vulnerable. For men, most of the times that's our pride. And pretty much in any
Ego.
situation that comes to mind, it's pride. Yeah, it's pride, ego. We just don't want to either admit we're wrong. We don't want to be given an answer that we think we're going to get. We don't want to give up control on some level. You know, whatever being vulnerable forces us to give up. As men, we're just wired to hold on to those things. And it makes it so much worse in the end when simply letting that, I say simply, obviously we know it's difficult at times, but with anything it gets easier with practice, is that if we could just learn to let our pride go, our ego go, and realize that, hey, no matter the societal pressures, the family pressures, the John hit on it, the pressures we put on ourselves about what we think being a man should be or how he should act or whatever. Listen, vulnerability, not complete and utter helplessness, right? Like not vulnerability to the point where you're getting run over and bullied and, people are taking advantage of you left and right. We can get into that here in a second, but it's going to cost something. But that what you're losing, that pride, that ego, that control is going to make you better for it because you're going to learn by being vulnerable. You're going to open yourself up to someone. You're going to allow yourself to feel. You're going to allow yourself to go through that process. And no matter how, if you're being vulnerable to another person, how they respond, that's on them. You went through the process of letting go. You went through the process of being vulnerable with them. You shared your feelings. You allowed your feelings to happen, whatever it is. And then you learn. And you're like, hey, most of the time, that's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Because the alternative is what? Keep it bottled up inside.
And I really think that
act like
we're
it's not
kind of
there.
at a point. We're kind of at this point with a societal shift. Like there was a video that popped up in my reels the other day of a guy who's sitting in a seat on the bus and riding, and this woman gets on and she's like, "I'm a lady, aren't you going to get up?" And he's like, "Do you believe in equal rights?" And she's like, "Well, of course." And he's like, "Perfect. This is my seat." And like, is that a fair comparison? Maybe, maybe not. But like this entire cultural shift of what is a man in 2025? When we look at the generations before us, whether it was Vietnam, Korea, World War II, those guys came home and it shell shock. They had a bunch of different names for post-traumatic stress. They just didn't even talk about it. And I think, I don't know, maybe in the mid-2000 teens, like it swung so far over that we talked about everything. Was that the right thing to do? Maybe, maybe not. Like people look at you the wrong way. And it's challenging because I think, and this is why we're here, like having a core group of individuals to be a sounding board, you have to be able to pick. Luther, you're talking about that story with your daughter. That's a perfect example. Like the opposite of just being vulnerable is this strength. And if you
Yes.
go in like a wrecking ball and you're approaching from the wrong angle, you're gonna hit so much more resistance. It's like, I don't know, doing a belly flop into a pool from 20 feet in the air versus just kind of slipping in. You have to understand the difference and be able to judge. And I don't know, maybe just having a couple, that one person in your life that you can be vulnerable with, and maybe be open with the fact, I need to be vulnerable with you right now. I'm feeling jealous. I'm feeling nervous. I'm feeling scared. Finances aren't going to work. Our relationship. I'm curious about this thing. I don't trust that person, whatever it may be. Find the people that you can be vulnerable with, because at some point it does have to come out. We've seen what happened to our fathers and our grandfathers when it didn't. And I tell you, it's tough to see.
No, it's very tough to see. Vulnerability is a strength. Luther's story alone, not only did it strengthen him, because God gave him the strength to do a 180 with the way, he was handling the situation. I guarantee you it strengthened his daughter because the way he came about it, she was like, Dad loves me. He cares about me. I can trust him with, feelings. And then it's going to probably strengthen him also because afterwards he's like, I learned from this. Here's how I can, make a better connection with my daughter. Here's how God has called me to handle this situation. Here's what I can do next time to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Vulnerability is a strength when used in the proper settings. I think we may all know people who may be a little too vulnerable in a way where they just tell everything to anyone, and you're just kind of like, hey, now slow your roll. That's a little too much. You probably shouldn't be saying that to everybody. Everybody doesn't need to know all that. I don't know if that's vulnerability on the extreme opposite end or if that's considered something else, but
Are y'all losing him too?
I think Ian's cutting out.
He's lagging.
Okay.
Oh no.
That's all right. We can start
always.
talking. Catch up. He'll catch.
Yeah, but man, you said something just then, Ian. And I'm blanking. I had a response, but then you said he started lagging, and it kind of went away. But yeah, the vulnerability as a strength really really speaks to me. Oh, you were talking about people being too vulnerable. I don't think those people, the people that are too vulnerable that share everything, I don't view that as vulnerability.
I'd love to hear more about that thought.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
I
I don't
feel
view
like
that
there's a
as
different name for it.
so. To me, that's more of coming from someone who I'm not an oversharer. I do share a lot. But for someone that overshares, I think that comes from a place of insecurity. And it's more of a search for affirmation than it is vulnerability. Search for affirmation or attention.
That makes sense.
More so than it is vulnerability. Right? Vulnerability requires discernment. If you look up the definition of vulnerability, it is the capability being capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, right? Like we're not talking about that in that sense. But it's like vulnerability is a capability, right? And so if someone's just like oversharing and pouring out and it's like I'm just going to be like super vulnerable, it's like to what avail? Like what's the goal, right? I think if you're gonna use that capability, it has to have an end in sight. You have to have an end in mind. There has to be a reason, right? Like the reason that I'm vulnerable with my wife is so that we can have a more intimate relationship. The reason I'm vulnerable with my kids is so that they can understand what healthy emotions look like and what it looks like to be expressive and know healthy ways for them to express themselves because they see that type of expression from both my wife and I, right? If we just like overshare, like it's just like for them it's just like okay, well I could just say do whatever, and that lacks control, and that's not a capability. Like a capability you have control over, right? And so it's vulnerability as a capability, not as a social outlet, if you will.
Labeling it as a form of intimacy, I think that's actually like pretty brilliant, man, because it really is. I think a lot of people confuse the word sexual and intimate, and they're not the same. And truly, that closeness, that confidence that is formed when you are being vulnerable with someone, you can have so much that comes out of it. Yeah.
The confidence. What? How did you just phrase that? The confidence that comes with being vulnerable. Like that feels like such an oxymoron, but it's not though. Right? Like I think like there has to be a level of confidence if you're going to possess the capability to be vulnerable.
That's right.
When
Have
we think from the relationship perspective,
yeah.
like opposites attract, law of nature, whatever your relationship is, but whether our communication is implicit or explicit, if it's not explicit, we are anticipating that our partner is going to guess what our weakness is. That kind of sounds like a recipe to fail. And look, guys, I'll tell you, like, I've cried. There are movies, you turn on Act of Valor, you turn on war movies, stuff like that, where guys lose all their buddies. Like, you'll see me on the couch in a corner. I'll have some emotions, and it is what it. Maybe that's vulnerability. I don't know. You could call it what you want to call it, but Most recently, I had a wife with my spouse, and I'm like, look, this is where we're at with our money. We're in an okay spot, but we want to be here. What's going to change? And we had a real conversation. We had a very real conversation, and there was some emotion on both sides. There was a lot of openness and expectations, but that conversation was probably a year overdue because of pride. And I'll tell you, as soon as we had it and as soon as we finished it, things just got better and better and better. And not only did they get better in the relationship, but professionally, we've both seen growth since having that conversation. It's almost as if something was missing there, like we weren't talking about the weak spots.
I wonder why. Well, I know why. I know why. You just said it. But I wonder who said, like, how did it become a societal norm that vulnerability equals weakness?
Mhm.
Like, how did we get to a place in society where, like, man, we're like I gotta, like, like, I'm gonna be rocked up and I'm gonna be hard and I'm gonna be like growing up in the hood, like, that's what it was. Like as a dude, like, you was hard, you didn't cry, nobody saw you, like, it was just like, you know, that was it. And then we got to a place where women were like, well, if I show them my weakness, then they can take advantage of me. But again, vulnerability requires discernment, but it also requires confidence. If I'm speaking in vulnerable, like if I'm in a situation where I'm being vulnerable, one, I have to have the confidence to know that and the self-control and the discernment to know that what I'm saying is the purpose of what I'm saying is for the edification of the whole, right? Like of all involved in the conversation, right? Like I'm not just gonna go into a situation and be vulnerable for vulnerability's sake, right? Like it's a capability that I use in order to increase the intimacy with those involved in the conversation, right? It's about connection, it's about relationship. And again, we see that modeled for us time and time and time and time again in scripture. We see that modeled for us, right? And going back to like fatherhood, I said this to y'all on a different call. Father is a borrowed term that we borrow from our Heavenly Father. And so it is our duty to steward that term that we've been blessed with. Groom is a borrowed term that we are called to steward with steward from the person that's giving it to us, right? And so when we look at the example, right, I don't want to misquote. Give me 1 second. If I could type, it would be much faster. It's Ephesians 5. That's what I thought it was, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to misquote because for whatever reason I get that and Corinthians mixed up. Ephesians 5:25. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for it. That's vulnerability, is it not? Like it says, we love our wives and we give ourselves up. We drop all the ego, we drop all the pride, we drop all the selfishness, and we take on this vulnerability that says, okay, we are in this together, right? And that's what it's all about, is being, the adage marriage is about compromise. I think that's why 50% of marriages in the United States end in divorce, right? Like marriage is not about compromise. Marriage is about selflessness. That's the point, right? So when I see a need, I desire to fill a need. And when both people are functioning in that way, you function as a union. That's vulnerability.
So we're talking about the change in culture, the change in society, and I'm keeping a close eye on the clock because I told my wife I'd be down here shortly. Great reason to keep this a short story. Are any of y'all gentlemen familiar with the name Desmond Doss?
Mm-hmm.
So Desmond Doss, 1940s, enlisted in the army, conscientious objector. He wanted to serve, but he would not carry a rifle. And if you talk about vulnerability, the man who joins the army and doesn't carry a rifle, between emotionally, the names that you would get called, the things that people would think, and physically going into combat without a weapon, you think about vulnerability in a culture that did not allow vulnerability. Desmond Doss is credited with saving the lives of an estimated 75 men on his own. Like, I'm getting chills thinking about the sacrifice that man went through and committed to be vulnerable because he loved his country and because he loved his God. And that was his calling. And he was very clearly put in that place for a particular reason, in the name of being, in the name of service. But the vulnerability at that time in a culture where everything he did was frowned upon, it wasn't frowned upon, it was unheard of. Who would do that? Who would be so open with their belief that they wouldn't even, he could have faked it. He could have. And I mean, how many of us do that in our day-to-day life? You know, there's something out there. But yeah, we're talking about the change in the generations and the change in what a man is in 2025 and what it is to be vulnerable. Hacksaw Ridge is a great movie for anybody who hasn't seen it. I'm going to give it a shameless plug. I cried. I'll tell you that. I think I probably ugly cried on that one. That was a good movie. But Desmond Doss, that's a great example of being vulnerable. Yeah. So,
I love it.
Gentlemen, with that, I need to bail. I got to go take care of my commitments. I look forward to seeing y'all.
That's right.
And I'll let y'all keep on recording.
Love it.
Hacksaw Ridge, that's my word.
Love it, Michael. Loser, I know Ian's like somewhere in the background, but I can't help. I want to keep going just a little bit longer, only because I gotta get this part out off my head here a little bit, because the more we talk about vulnerability, I know in the beginning you mentioned, I think it was you or Michael, talked about vulnerability almost requiring sacrifice, giving up something. I wonder how many men nowadays are just unwilling to sacrifice for other people. How much of it is just an ego pride-driven thing where we're just only worried about me, myself, and I, that we're not willing to sacrifice our own time. We're not willing to sacrifice our decision. We're not willing to sacrifice our finances, our this, our that, because, well, we don't want it. We don't want it. And losing that track, like when you're talking about, we have the greatest example. I mean, we have all these examples in the Bible, but yet a lot of people don't follow them. A lot of people don't follow. A lot of people don't allow themselves and give themselves the permission to be vulnerable, and why not? And
It goes back to exactly what you said, man. In my opinion, I think the answer to your question is most. I think we've been conditioned to believe that we live in a me society, right? You've heard the statistic, the number one type of picture taken is a selfie, blah, 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 right? We live in a me-centered society where everything is about what can I gain? What can I do? What can I get? What can I? And because society is inward focused, vulnerability becomes I just had the word and I lost it. Because society is inward focused, vulnerability becomes more of a detriment. That's not the word I'm looking for.
it's a good word.
Like it's viewed more as a detriment than an asset, right? Because people don't understand it. They don't and because in the cases where they do see people being vulnerable, it's not used with discernment. It's used as an attempt to gain clout or affirmation or attention, right? And so then it's like, well, I don't want to do that. And so they go all the way back to this. If I'm not going to do that, and if that's what vulnerability looks like, then I'm just not going to say nothing. And I think for men, right, like we've just been conditioned that like we got to be the rock, right? We got to be the rock. We got to be this, like, we got to be this cold, hard thing that like people can, like our family can stand on, right? Now here's the deal, right? Like, yes, the foundation is solid, but even skyscrapers have a little bit of wiggle to them. They have to, because when the winds blow and the storms come, if they were super rigid, they would fail structurally. And so they have to be able to sway a little bit.
You did,
Right?
right?
Sway with discernment.
Exactly, right?
know what I'm saying? And so for us, vulnerability is something I look for in my friendships. Vulnerability, like if I don't feel like I can be my real self around you, not it's not that like I'm not gonna hang out with you, but like it's more of we gotta if I don't feel like I can be vulnerable around you, I am much more cautious.
Yeah. You kind of put, those safeguards, those barriers, those limits on what that friendship could look like, right? You don't
Yeah.
allow yourself to really get to know the other person. You don't allow yourself to really open up and, you know, be there in times where things are challenging, be there in times where things are rough. I mean, I can remember a time in my life where I was really, really angry, and I held on to it for a long period of time. I was, had some things going on that just caused me to really just hate life. And I had no outlets. I had no people in my life who I could be vulnerable with. And, that was for a couple of different reasons. One, I didn't go out and seek that out here closely, but two, I didn't have the friendships digitally that I had today. Right. But I look back and I think if I hadn't found those people and knew at that time that I needed somehow some outlet, some way to talk to people and to be vulnerable, I don't even want to know what I would have done. I don't want to know what kind of direction my life would have taken, because I would have held on to those emotions in such a way that would have been detrimental to my marriage. It would have been detrimental to the way that I parent my kids. They would grow up thinking that anger is just a status norm and this is what daddy does. Daddy gets angry, he punches walls. Daddy does, he storms off, he slams the door, he might just leave the house and go driving and not come home for a little bit. Like, the impact would have been generational if I hadn't learned to be vulnerable with other people. And I feel like that's unfortunately the cycle we're in right now, is we're seeing generational impact of this societal shift. And it's going to take men who are willing to be vulnerable and step up and go against the current to break that cycle.
Yep. Here's the deal, man. You can be, I believe as dads, like we do have to be provider protectors, right? But the first person we have to protect our family from is us. And vulnerability is a
So, dude,
vital part of that.
it's
Allowing
trying
your
to
kids to see
reconnect. I think
you
I'm done.
handle your
I
emotions
gotta upgrade our internet, I
well,
think.
Mm-hmm.
you know, allowing your sons to see you cry, allowing your sons to see you grieve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also allowing them to see what it looks like to emote in praise, right? Praise and worship, and allowing them to see you pray and the things that God's put on your heart, like allowing them to see those things. Because how can we raise emotionally healthy children if we don't set emotionally healthy boundaries? For example.
I think there's a Bible verse in there too that talks about that there's a time to mourn and a time for joy and a time to grieve and all those things that you're talking about. It's our job to teach that. It's our job to, show them that this is okay. This is normal. These are real. These are real feelings that you should not only be able to express, but acknowledge and know that it's okay. It doesn't make you any less of a boy if you decide you want to cry. I mean, when my grand passed a couple of years ago, my son, saw me crying, and I wanted him to know that that's normal and that's expected and that's okay. That's good. The process is real. Be allowed to do that. Ian, it looks like you're back, kind of.
I'm so mad at my internet right
Maybe.
now. I don't even know. It streams just fine. We game just fine. I try to do a podcast with my bros, and it's like, screw you. No, it's not going to happen. So I got to upgrade my internet or something. Sounds like you guys are handling business, though. I appreciate it. Y'all are killing it. I know. I got to look into that. I locked myself out of my Frontier account, actually, while I was reconnecting, trying to log in and figure all that out. So that's fun. That's something for tomorrow. Jeez.
Well, I think I'm good, fellas. My wife and I have,
Perfect.
speaking of vulnerability, we have some more conversations that we need to
There
have.
you
So
go.
we're going to go do that.
That's fair.
Go do it.
You guys, cool. Well, thank you guys for handling
All right,
that
y'all.
one.
Hey, not a problem, man.
Yeah,
It's a
man.
good topic.
All right, awesome. Well, I can't wait to hear the playback because apparently I just wasn't around for any of it.
The user coming in clear. So I'm wondering if yours is multi-user, like when you get 3, 4.
It seems to be but like that's an internet thing, right? Anyway, before we do that, thank y'all for tuning in. We should probably log off first before we get into a heated debate and discussion about internet. But thank y'all. Episode 7, Yeah, of the Bro Code podcast is complete vulnerability. You got any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comments, man. If you got any topics you want us to cover as well, we're all ears. We want to hear from y'all. Like, follow, subscribe on YouTube and Spotify. Please give us that 5-star rating because it helps us in the algorithms trying to get the word out. And y'all have a great night or day whenever it is you're listening to this. See you next week. But yeah, it says stopping. It's even taking forever to stop. Something went wrong. Okay, whatever.